So what do we do about a passage like Romans chapter 5, verses 12 through 21? The passage is pretty densely packed. If you read through it, pretty soon you start to get lost, and the subjects and the predicates of each sentence start to fold over on each other, Inception style, and it just is so difficult to keep track of what Paul is arguing here that you might feel lost, and you might feel like, boy, I'm just not following what all this is supposed to be saying. And so I think that this is a challenging passage. It's one that's kind of got a reputation for being one of the harder passages and one of the hardest books. But I think we can ask ourselves some basic questions. We can talk through a couple doctrines, and we can think historically about what the church has said about it in the past and decide if that's really what the whole counsel of Scripture is saying for us. Let me put it on the screen, and you can pause and read the passage for yourself. So what can we say about this passage? Well, first, primarily it is about Jesus Christ. And it's about the reassurance that Paul is trying to give us that we can absolutely have hope and confidence and certainty in the act of this one man, Jesus Christ, on the cross. He did this one act, and this one man is able to save us. And you might ask, well, boy, that's a lot of work for one man. I mean, there's billions of us potentially here. And so how is this one person able to do it? And the example that Paul uses is, well, we're in this boat because of one man. Adam sinned and started us all down this path of rebellion from God and sinfulness. And so one man sinned and got us into this mess. One man is able to fix it. And so that is Paul's primary argument. But once you start talking about, well, yeah, that one man, Adam, he sinned, and now we all have sin, and we all have this fallen nature, and what do we do? Doesn't this teach original sin? Well, historically, it does serve as the passage that primarily teaches original sin. There's several others too that allude to the idea that we are either born sinful or conceived sinful. Certainly that sin is in the nature of all people, that in our flesh we have a sinfulness about us. That's taught in one form or another, really, Old Testament and New Testament. But this passage is held up as kind of like, well, this is the passage that explains it. And we look at it and we're like, boy, this is a difficult passage to understand. And I would counter a little bit, I'd at least give a little bit of pushback, because this is not a passage about Adam. This is not a passage that's setting out the doctrine of original sin. I think you might find hints of it here, but I don't think this is about that. It's about the primacy, the effectiveness, the importance of the cross. Not about Adam and his sin, but about Jesus and his salvation. And so Jesus is held up here. Adam is the foil to that. How can Jesus, the one man, save us? Well, Adam, the one man, messed it up to start with. And so it's that contrast that is pointing to the sufficiency of Jesus Christ, not the fallenness of Adam or an effect that's been inherited down. Now, historically speaking, the church has taught that. There's been several different groups through history and still today that teach a form of original sin. There's several different parts to that, but essentially a child is born with an inherited guilt. Adam sinned originally, and now we have a guiltiness, because how can you send someone to hell without guilt? So a child is born with some level of guiltiness or culpability, and therefore that child, if that child were to die, would go straight to hell. You can see why that would be objectionable to some people. Jesus said that you need to, in order to enter the kingdom of heaven, become like these children. There's not a lot of indication that Jesus taught that children were inherently evil. Maybe he never served in the church nursery. But you have this doctrine of original sin. And people argue, well, this is surely being taught here. But I don't think it's about Adam or original sin. It's about Jesus and the sufficiency of the cross. And in order to suss that out, you're going to have to decide, what do I do with the words many and all? I took a piece of paper and printed out the chapter, and I took a highlighter and highlighted in different colors every time it said many or all, every time it said all. And essentially those two groups, when it says that all people, death came to all people, all sinned, condemnation for all people, or if it said, that many died by the trespass of one man, those words all and many essentially serve to talk about the same group. Many is not contrasted to all, which you might say, oh, well, did everyone show up? Well, many of them did. That would be contrasting many to all. Many in this passage is being contrasted to one. And so instead of one man through whom sin came into the world, or one man through whom we find salvation, we have a plurality. One sins, many feel the consequences. One brings salvation, many feel the consequences. The plurality feel the consequences, as opposed to one. And so you have these words that are used, but what happened is that as we read it, and especially if you're trying to hold up the doctrine of original sin, then what you'll say is, well, Adam's sin affected everyone. That was universal. But Jesus' salvation only affects the elect. And so only a minority actually are affected by Jesus. So what Jesus did on the cross is smaller in its effect than what Jesus did on the cross is smaller in its effect than what Adam did in the Garden of Eden. And I don't think that's what Paul is arguing at all. I think he emphatically says that Jesus trumps Adam, that Jesus is bigger, that what he did was what was more powerful, it was greater than that. He says the gift is not like the trespass. It's bigger and better and has a more profound effect. And so what do you do with this idea that there's this original sin that's handed down? I think that Romans chapter 5 is arguing that there's an original grace that reverberates forward and backward through history, just like someone who had faith in the Old Testament is ultimately saved, even though they wouldn't have known Jesus' name necessarily, because they had faith in God, their salvation is still through Jesus Christ. I think in the same way, this cancellation of Adam's sin goes both ways through history, all the way back to Adam's children. And Adam's children were not born inherently sinful, inherently guilty, and bound for hell. Instead, Jesus Christ canceled that entirely and completely. I'd argue that even if you have the worst idea of original sin, Romans 5 says that is completely canceled out. But therein lies another problem. You teach that the sin of Adam is completely canceled out, then are we talking about a universalism where everybody gets saved? And I would still say that that's not taught here either. The only thing that is universal is the effect of Adam's sin and the cancellation of it by Jesus. But that's not the only sin that's committed. You see in verse 16, it says that the judgment followed one sin and brought condemnation, but the gift followed many trespasses. Not one. It's one of the places many is highlighted. It's not one trespass, but many trespasses. And so I might have had the effect of Adam's original sin, but Jesus canceled it out with his original grace. But then by the time I reach an age of accountability, I'm now choosing to be sinful and selfish. I'm rebelling against God in 1,000 ways, big and small, on my own. And that personal sin, I'm accountable for. That personal sin undoes whatever I might have had if I died in infancy. I might have gone to heaven. But now that I've reached an age of accountability and sin for myself, then my personal sin needs a personal salvation, which Paul is going to spend most of the first several chapters of Romans, the first 2/3 of the book, focusing on how Jesus Christ is sufficient for that salvation as well. One more thing about the original sin. Original sin, one of the consequences was death. You say, well, boy, if Jesus canceled out original sin, then he forgot about that death thing, because, boy, everybody seems to die. We're suffering about a 100% mortality rate. Well, that's true, But even death is going to be cured, because in the resurrection, everyone will defeat death. Now, not everybody is going to be raised to glory, only those who personally turn to Jesus Christ and are personally saved through his grace. But even those who are raised for condemnation, they also will see something after death. Death will not be the very end for them. There will be an existence that we call hell, that is outside of God's plan for his elect, God's plan for his people. And so death is also defeated by Jesus. And so Jesus is in no way inferior to Adam. He is superior to Adam. He cancels out the effect of what Adam has done, and he can cancel out the effect of what you and I have done.